The restaurant was packed, the air buzzing with the sounds of clinking glasses and low conversation. A young waitress moved swiftly between tables, balancing plates with practiced ease. She was polite, professional, and clearly doing her best to keep up with the evening rush. But not everyone was in the mood to be kind. At one corner table sat a man who looked like he had just walked out of a high-rise office. He was well dressed, his watch gleaming under the dim lights, and his smirk carried the confidence of someone used to getting his way. From the moment he sat down, his attitude was clear, impatient, dismissive, and eager to make someone feel small. And unfortunately, that someone was the waitress. He sighed loudly as she approached, barely glancing at the menu before snapping, "Took you long enough. Let's hope the food here isn't as slow as the service." The waitress, keeping her composure, smiled and took his order without a word. But it didn't stop there. Throughout the meal, he continued to make comments, sending dishes back, demanding extra attention, treating her as if she were beneath him. He clearly enjoyed the power he thought he had over her. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that fate had a different plan for him. Because the next time he saw this waitress, it wouldn't be with an apron in her hands. It would be in a sleek office, behind a massive desk as his new boss. And when that moment came, let's just say, the look on his face was priceless. The night at the restaurant ended without much fanfare. The waitress had remained professional despite the man's repeated attempts to belittle her. She had seen his type before, the kind who believed their status or wealth gave them the right to treat people as less than human. But instead of letting it get under her skin, she focused on something bigger, her future. She knew this job was temporary. What he didn't know was that she had been working towards something much greater than just serving tables. As the man left, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the table without a second glance, the waitress allowed herself a small, knowing smile. If only he knew who she really was. If only he knew that in just a few days, their roles would be reversed. The following Monday, the man strode into his office building with the same confidence he carried everywhere. He had an important meeting scheduled, one that could determine the next phase of his career. There were whispers that the company had been acquired, that new leadership was stepping in. Some were nervous, others excited, but he wasn't concerned. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, irreplaceable. No matter who was in charge, he would find a way to impress them, just as he always did. He adjusted his tie and walked into the sleek boardroom, ready to make a strong first impression. But the moment he saw the woman seated at the head of the table, his entire world tilted. There she was. The waitress. But she wasn't wearing an apron now. She wasn't balancing plates or taking orders. She was dressed in sharp, professional attire, exuding authority and confidence. The realization hit him like a freight train. She was his new boss. For the first time in a long time, he was at a loss for words. His throat went dry as she glanced up, locking eyes with him, the slightest hint of amusement in her expression. But she didn't acknowledge their past, not yet. Instead, she simply gestured toward a seat. "Please, take a seat. We have a lot to discuss." The meeting proceeded, but he barely heard a word. His mind raced, trying to piece together how this could be possible. How had he misjudged her so completely? Meanwhile, the other employees were in awe of their new CEO. They had heard she was brilliant, that she had worked her way up in the industry through sheer determination. She was known for her keen business sense, her ability to turn struggling companies around. What they didn't know was that she had taken the waitress job not because she needed to, but because she had wanted to understand the business from the ground up before stepping in. After the meeting, she called him into her office. He walked in hesitantly, the arrogance he once carried noticeably absent. The power dynamic had shifted, and they both knew it. She leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment before speaking. "Interesting world, isn't it?" she mused, her voice calm. "One day, you're sitting in a restaurant, talking down to someone. The next, that same person is in a position to make decisions that affect your future." He swallowed hard, knowing there was no excuse he could offer that would erase what had happened. For the first time in a long time, he felt small. vulnerable. But the real question lingered in the air: what would she do with this power? Would she fire him on the spot? Make his life miserable the way he had tried to make hers? Or would she take a different path altogether? The suspense hung heavy in the room, leaving him to wonder what would come next. And he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. The silence in the office was suffocating. He could feel the weight of her gaze, assessing him, measuring his worth beyond the tailored suit and expensive watch he had always relied on to command respect. But today, none of that mattered. She tapped her fingers lightly against the desk, thoughtful but unreadable. "Tell me something," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "Do you treat all service workers the way you treated me that night? Or was I just lucky?" His jaw tightened. There was no easy way out of this. He had spent his career perfecting the art of excuses, of spinning things in his favor, but now? Now, there was no clever explanation that could erase what she had seen for herself. He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. "I wasn't at my best that night." Her lips curled slightly, though it wasn't a smile. "Is that so?" He hesitated. He had never been forced to examine his behavior before. In his world, people overlooked arrogance if it came with success. No one ever called him out like this. He could have lied, brushed it off as a bad day, but something about the way she watched him expecting more made him pause. "I don't know," he admitted finally, surprising even himself. "Maybe I have a habit of not thinking about how I treat people. Maybe I assumed it didn't matter." She nodded slowly, leaning forward. "But it does matter." The words hit harder than he expected. He shifted in his seat, uneasy under her steady gaze. He had built his career on confidence, on the belief that he deserved to be where he was. But now, sitting across from her, he was forced to consider a truth he had never faced: maybe he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. "I'm not here to ruin you," she continued, her tone measured. "I could, but that's not the kind of leader I want to be." That caught him off guard. He had been bracing for the worst: public humiliation, a swift termination, maybe even a speech about karma. But instead, she was offering something far more unsettling: a chance to change. "I worked my way up in this industry," she went on. "I've seen people like you my whole career, men who think power comes from stepping on others." "But real power?" She shook her head. "Real power comes from knowing your value without tearing someone else down." He swallowed, absorbing her words. He had always thought of himself as successful, but now he wondered, had he really earned respect, or had people just feared the consequences of standing up to him? "I want to keep you on," she said finally. "But not as you are." His eyes snapped up to hers, uncertain if he had heard her correctly. "You're not firing me?" "Not yet," she said smoothly. "But consider this your wake-up call. If you want to stay in this company, you're going to have to prove that you belong here, not because of your title, but because of your actions." A flicker of something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Gratitude? Humility? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that, for the first time in his career, someone had challenged him in a way that actually mattered. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. Weeks passed, and the shift in him was gradual, but undeniable. At first, people watched him with cautious curiosity, waiting for the arrogant executive they had always known to resurface. But something was different. He started listening more, cutting back on the sharp, dismissive tone that had once been second nature. He began acknowledging the people he had overlooked: the assistants, the janitors, the receptionists, people who had always been invisible to him before. One day, he found himself in the company's break room, pouring himself a cup of coffee when a familiar voice spoke up. "Didn't think I'd ever see you in here." He turned to find one of the junior employees eyeing him with a mix of surprise and amusement. In the past, he might have ignored the comment, but today, he offered a small, self-aware chuckle. "Yeah," he admitted. "Guess I'm seeing things differently these days." The employee raised an eyebrow, then gave a slight nod. "Good. It's about time." The moment stuck with him. Had his reputation really been that bad? He supposed he already knew the answer. But at least now, he was doing something about it. Meanwhile, his new boss, the woman he had once so carelessly disrespected, watched his transformation with quiet satisfaction. She hadn't let him off easy, and she never would. But she had given him a chance, and against all odds, he was taking it. One evening, as she was leaving the office, she passed by the front desk and overheard him speaking to the receptionist. "Hey, you handled that client call really well today," he said, offering a nod of appreciation. "That wasn't easy." The receptionist blinked in surprise before smiling. "Thanks. I appreciate that." The interaction was small, barely a blip in the grand scheme of things. But for the woman who had once been a waitress at his table, it was proof that people could change. Maybe not all at once. Maybe not without effort. But change was possible. As she stepped into the elevator, she allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes, the best revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was watching someone become a better person because they had no other choice. And in the end, that was more satisfying than any moment of petty payback could ever be.